This is the English Literature Web YouTube channel. I am Prof.L.B.Gayakawad. Today is teaching the topic short story characteristics. This is the lecture 3rd and part 2nd. Here today in this topic we are studying the characteristics of the short story. The fourth characteristic is the moral message. Remember, life runs with the moral principle. Without moral principle or morality, life has no importance. The short story, being man's social life, has the moral message. But the moral message is not essential and compulsory. Remember, man is the social animal, and this social animal lives with other man, and that's why the social life becomes very much important, because everybody has the right to live on the earth planet. That's why the literature has taken the procedure of giving message to the persons, and that's why in the literature here especially we are talking about the short story, that in the short story also there is the moral message to the persons. But sometimes this moral message based on the morality is not essential or compulsory. In literature, every writer wants to give moral message to society through his writing. Hence, moral message has been significant part of the literature. Some literary types, we can say from poems to short story, give the open and moral, internal moral message. Remember, we have seen that this literature has the history from the poem to the short story. Again, there are some essays, there are some paragraphs. Means this literature has increased a lot in the span of man's life. And that's why every form of literature uh, wants to give the moral message to people, and that's why that moral message is very important. At the time, that moral message is noticed easily by the readers. Remember, when the moral message is given through the piece of literature, that moral message is underlined or is understood very important by the persons who see or who look, I will say, or who read that moral message. But maximally, the moral message is not found easily in the open situation. Remember, it is the particular thing that the writer gives the moral message in hidden situation, that he gives the moral message internally, because every word has two meanings, and the first meaning is external and the second meaning is internal. So the writer uses the particular words which have the internal meanings. They have actually the external meanings also. But when we take the internal meaning, that is the hidden meaning of those words, then we can understand the moral message, because the corners of the words have the internal message. And that's why here it is said that the moral message is not found always in open situation, it is found always in internal situation. Therefore, we have to trace it out. It means that we have to find out the moral message. Actually, when we see or when we go into the passage, or suppose into the short story, then we can find out that moral message. Otherwise, if you see that short story openly, or I will say on the basis of the profound knowledge, if we see that story, then we will not find out that particular moral message, because that moral message is there in the hidden situations. And that's why we have to see that moral message going into the short stories, characters or situations or actions. Means we have to do there the analytical study of that particular situation, and it becomes complex for us. And in this way, this moral message becomes a complex thing for us, because we have to go uh, into the detail part of the situation, and that's why it becomes very complex for us. But without moral, remember, without moral means without a philosophy or without culture, civilization, or without the moral message, the piece of literature cannot be the classical one. Remember, there are the pieces of literature. We have seen that Shakespeare has written his dramas, his comedies, his tragedies, his poems. But the poems and all the literature of Shakespeare is called a classical literature because of the moral messages which he has given through his pieces. So here we completed the moral message characteristic. Now we are going to the fifth characteristic, and that is the notion of conflict. Remember, in the short story, there is the conflict. And if there is no conflict in the short story, then that short story will not be famous, popular, or it will not be interesting for the readers. And that's why the conflict is very much important in the short story. This is the second characteristic of the short story. Short story deals with a problem of life being a part of life. Remember, when the short story writer writes his short story, he selects some situations, some plot from the social life of man, and he deals with the problem of life, because a man has life, and when man lives his life, he faces many problems. And such one or two problems the short story writer takes from the life, and he uh, begins his short story to write. And in this way, the conflict is called the problem in the life of the characters. When the short story runs, this conflict runs with the characters. Therefore, no short story can be without the notion of the problem. So, if there is no problem in the short story, it means that if there is no conflict in the short story, that story will not be a popular story, or that story will not be accepted by the readers in maximum, I will say, quantity. And this problem in the short story is called a conflict. The conflict is the soul of the plot in the short story. Remember, this conflict is called the soul of the plot. Plot means the particular, I will say, map of the story, the particular building of the story, the particular area of the story. And in the area of the story, if there is no conflict or the problem running with the characters, then that short story has no importance, that is said here. The conflict is shown as external or internal. Remember, the conflict is said as external or internal. External conflict is seen easily, but the internal conflict is not seen easily, and this internal conflict runs with the heart, with the mind, in the heart of the characters. That is the point of the psychology. Means psychologically, those characters are disturbed by that problem, and that's why this is called the internal problem. The conflict in the short story may be single. Remember, there should be the conflict in the short story, and that should be the single conflict, because the short story is a small writing, and that's why that conflict, or I will say that notion of the conflict, should be single. There may be more conflicts linked. Means remember, there is one main conflict, and again other conflicts are interrelated or interlinked with the main conflict. Now, the last characteristic of the short story is the end of the short story. Remember, the end of the short story is very much important in the life of the story. Remember, when the short story writer writes his short story, then the end, I will say, or the last situation of the short story is very much important. If there is the unexpected surprise or shock to the readers, the story is interesting. Remember, when the writer, that is the short story writer, goes to end his short story, then he has to give, or he must give the end very surprisingly or very shockingly, because that end should be shocking or surprising. If that end is shocking or surprising, then the readers are very much interested to read and to make it popular in the society. That's why the end of the short story should be very much interesting, and there should be the unexpected surprise. If such type of unexpected surprise and shocking situation, uh, these things are there, really speaking, then that short story is really the interesting short story. Every good short story must end with impression, paying attention to a few characters. Remember, finally, there should be the few characters only. There should not be more characters, because the more characters will make that short story very complex, and that short story will not be read by any kind of persons. Will not be read, means will not be read by all those readers, and those readers will not be satisfied by that story. And the unity of the effect and more attention on creating the mood of the readers. Remember, when the short story writer is writing that short story, he should pay attention to the mood of the readers, because the mood of the readers is very much important. And also, he must pay attention to the effect of the unity, because that unity and action of the short story, action of the characters, and all these important aspects should be paid attention by the particular short story writer, and then that short story will be very much famous. Here, the point is that the short story writer should see only these things which just we discussed. He should not pay more attention here to the particular plot of the short story. He should see all these points, means he should see the mood of the readers, then he should see the unity of the effect, and then he should see the point of the few characters. So here today in the lecture third and part second, we have seen the characteristics of the short story. In the next video, we will see the next part. Till then, thank you very much.